Now that the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago.
Much better than some computers. All three of us.
Hello, my name is Justin Nato, faculty at Auburn High School Scholastic, team coached by Ms. Ale, Mr. and Mr. Patton, and my team is also on my left to right.
Brielle.
Ashley.
Okay, so the only thing for Marengo here to know is if I, just a reminder on bonuses, if they're incorrect, I'm either gonna say no or I'm gonna say bounce. And that starts your 3 seconds, that goes to you then. So is there any other questions? Are we all set? Okay, all right, here we go. Toss-up number 1, category is literature. Duff Twiston served as a model for one woman in this novel, in which Bill Gorton goes fishing at Borgate with the British war veteran Wilson Harris. Later, Bill tells this book's protagonist to drink 3 absinthes in a row to cure his depression. In this novel, the former Princeton boxing champion Robert Cohn beats up Pedro Romero on the day before Romero wins in a bullfight. For 10 points. Yep. Your bonus is in science. When viewed in a microscope, this process can have a beads on a string appearance due to polysomes. Part 1. Name this process in which codons are read at a ribosome to assemble amino acids into a protein. 2. Amino acids are carried to the ribosome by these molecules, often depicted as a cloverleaf shape with an anticodon loop at one end. Yep. Part 3. Because translation begins with the start codon AUG, this amino acid is always the first in a eukaryotic polypeptide chain. This amino acid and cysteine are the only ones to contain a sulfur atom. Yep. 20 to Auburn, 10 to Marengo on that.
Pretty cool about it.
Toss up number 2. Category social studies. In this province, towns like Markham, Richmond Hill, and Peterborough are developed around roads that are angled roughly 16 degrees off the north-south line. The Kawartha Lakes are north of this province's largest city, which became a megacity amalgamated from cities like Scarborough and York in 1998. Mississauga and Hamilton are port cities. Yep. Your bonus is in literature. The image of celestial choir enthroned in realms of light begins a poem addressed to this man who is told to proceed with virtue on thy side. For 10 points each, part 1. Name this founding father, praised as a great chief for his success as commander of the American armies during the Revolution.
Washington.
To His Excellency General Washington is a work by this 18th century poet who wrote of being taken to the U.S. as a slave in her poem On Being Brought from Africa to America. Yes. Wheatley's poem To Maecenas is addressed to the Roman patron of several poets, compares the author to this Roman playwright, himself a freed African slave. Like Plautus, this playwright adapted Greek comedies into works like The Self-Tormentor. Answer? No. No. Terrence. Julius, Terentius, up there. 20 points to Auburn on that bonus. Toss-up number 3, category is math. This number is the maximum value of the scalinity of a triangle. This number has a continued fraction representation consisting of only ones. According to... What? No. According to Benet's formula, this number raised to the nth power and divided by the square root of 5 rounds to the nth Fibonacci number. This value is equal to the diagonal length divided by side length in a rectangular pentagon. This number, which is 1 more than its reciprocal, has a value of 1 plus root 5 all over 2. For 10 points, name this irrational number symbolized 5.
Golden ratio.
Yes. Bonus is social studies. After 9 years, St. Augustine renounced his belief in this faith because he could not accept its dualistic notion of a spiritual world of good alongside a material world of evil. Part 1. Name this Gnostic religion whose elect and hearer members believed the soul was in a constant battle between the powers of light and darkness. This religion was a major rival of Christianity before the rise of Islam.
Zoroastrianism?
Nope. Yep. Part 2. Both Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism were founded by prophets who lived in this modern-day country. The Shia cleric Ayatollah Khomeini led the Islamic revolution in this country in 1979.
Iran?
Yep. Part 3. This religion, which teaches that Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad were all manifestations of the same God, also has its roots in Iran. This religion stresses the equal validity of all faiths, and its universal house of justice is in Israel.
Pantheism?
Nope. Yes. So 20 points to Auburn, 10 to Marengo. Toss-up number 4, category science. A table of Clebsch-Gordon coefficients is helpful for summing these quantized values found in classical electrodynamics by the cross product of the position and pointing vectors. This quantity is 0 for an electron in an s orbital, and its derivative with respect to time is torque. Wind speed increases approaching the eye of a hurricane due to conservation of this.
Angular momentum?
Yes. Your bonus is in math. One way to mathematically define real numbers is with the data kind cuts, or data kind cuts, for 10 points each. Part 1. Data-kind cuts define real numbers as collection of rational numbers that form this type of set with no gaps. This type of set can be described as open, closed, or half open.
Continuous?
No, bounce. No, intervals. Part 2. Key to the definition of a data-kind cut is that the rationals have this property within the set of real numbers. This property, which asserts that there is always a rational number between any two distinct real numbers, implies that different Dedekind cuts will always correspond to different real numbers.
Continuous?
Nope, bounce.
No.
It's denseness or density. Part 3. The density of the rational numbers can be used to explain why 0.9 repeating is actually equal to this integer, as it is impossible to find a rational number between them.
One.
Yep. 10 points to Marengo on that bonus. Toss-up number 5, category is fine arts. One of this city's 18th century collectors wrote artist names on each piece and is remembered as this city's reliable hand. The tripartite window of Palladian architecture is named for this city. The Palazzo Labbia's frescoes by Tiepolo are among the last great works of this city's namesake school, which had earlier produced Giorgione's The Tempest. Yeah. Your bonus is in history. By performing an act of homage at a commendation ceremony, a bond between vassal and lord was forged under this system. Part 1. A set of mutual obligations, especially military service in exchange for fiefs, defined what social system of medieval Europe. The liege was a vassal's foremost lord under this system. Yes. Most of Europe's free farmers fell into serfdom under this principle of feudalism, in which the farmer surrendered his land and agreed to work for a lord in exchange for protection. Nobles thus acquired the large estates that gave this principle its name. Yes. Part 3. Feudal Europe largely followed this custom in which only the firstborn son would inherit the family's manor and serfs. Salic law extends this custom to prevent females from inheriting the throne in a monarchy. Bounce? Primogeniture. 20 points to Auburn on that bonus. Toss-up number 6, category is history. It says description is acceptable. A drop in bird diversity coinciding with this process is attributed to the Kior rat. The progress of this process can be mapped by the distribution of basalt adze. Tacking and outrigging were prerequisite skills for this process, which likely began with the Lapita culture. A now discredited westward theory for this process was investigated by the Kon-Tiki expedition. This prompt. Yep. Your bonus is in fine arts. Or Polynesia, they would have called it. Fine arts. The first edition of the score for this collection of 3 symphonic sketches for orchestra used...
Whenever you are.
Aaron?
Can we get a quick score check on this tape?
Toss-up number 7, category science. To reestablish food chains affected by this phenomenon, possum shrimp have been introduced to Canadian lakes. Red spruce population is a sensitive bioindicator of this phenomenon, responsible for Central Europe's Black Triangle. Studies of the Hubbard Brook experimental forest confirm this phenomenon mobilizes toxic aluminum in the soil while leaching plant nutrients like magnesium. Desulfurization of power plant exhaust gas. Nope. Reduces this phenomena that can dissolve marble statues.
Acid rain.
Yes. Your bonus is social studies. The slaughterhouse cases decided in 1873 left this amendment's privileges or immunities clause with essentially no impact on state law. Name this amendment that guarantees full citizenship for all people born or naturalized in the United States. It was the second of the Reconstruction Amendments passed just after the Civil War.
14.
Yep. Since the early 20th century, the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause has been used to conclude that the Bill of Rights applies to state governments as well as Congress, a process known by this term. This process applies for rights that are fundamental to a scheme of ordered liberty.
Answer?
Ratification.
Nope. Well,
Yes.
you got it. Part 3. In 2018, Timms versus Indiana, Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh expressed their surprise that the excessive fines clause of this amendment had yet to be incorporated as applying to the states. No, Eighth Amendment. 10 points each on that bonus. Toss up number 8, categories history. Point 3 of this conflict's Declaration of the People decried a monopoly of the beaver trade. This conflict, which resulted in the Treaty of Middle Plantation, was preceded by a massacre of the Occaneechi, and it convened a reform assembly that temporarily raised tobacco prices. Governor William Berkeley refused. Yes. Category. Your bonus is in science. When pressure increases to 58 gigapascals at a temperature of 600 kelvins, zirconium remains a solid, but its crystals undergo an isostructural one of these processes. Part 1. Name this type of process, such as freezing or boiling, in which a substance transforms between solid, liquid, and gas states. Yep. On a pressure temperature diagram, the slope of a line that represents a phase change is given by this equation. The slope from this equation equals latent heat divided by the product of temperature and change in volume. You got it. Part 3. A phase rule named for this American scientist predicts that a solid liquid gas water mixture can only exist in equilibrium at a single pressure temperature combination. The change in this man's namesake energy is 0 during a phase transition. 30 on the bonus.
Can I have a score check, please?
I got 200 to 70.
Thank you.
Seryoza, after his wife runs off with a cavalry officer. Yep. 30 on the bonus. Toss up 10, categories literature. This junior doctor drew on his experiences as an intern in St. Thomas's Hospital to write his first novel, Liza of Lambeth. This author visited Pago Pago, where he said his story about the missionary Davidson's attempts to reform Miss Thompson's reign. The author used Paul Gauguin as the inspiration for the stockbroker turned artist Charles Strickland. In an autobiographical work by this man, Mildred Rogers has a tumultuous affair with the club-footed painter Philip Carey. Yes. Your bonus is in math. Give the following about solids with 8 triangular faces. Part 1. The simplest solid with 8 triangular faces is this platonic solid with 8 faces and 6 vertices. Yes. Part 2. Another solid with 8 triangular faces can be formed by truncating this other platonic solid. The truncation process on this solid slices a chunk off from each of its vertices, leaving a triangle in its place and turning this solid's original faces into octagons. Yes. A truncated cube whose construction was previously described has this number of edges. Nope, bounce.
12.
36. So 20, no, 10 each on that bonus. Toss up number 11, category is miscellaneous. A taxidermied one of these animals wears a rubber tire as a belt in Robert Rauschenberg's Combine monogram. A band named for this animal incorrectly listed the Tampa Bay Bucks going all the way to January as an impossible event in Cubs in 5, written by John Darnielle. One of,
Mountain goats.
yeah. Your bonus is in history. The Mayaguez assault, Utuado uprising, and a 1954 attack on the U.S. House of Representatives were all carried out to protest the Estado Libre Asociado status of this island. Part 1. Name this Caribbean island that has been a Commonwealth territory of the U.S. since 1952. In the 2020 referendum, 52% voted in favor of the island becoming the 51st state.
Puerto Rico.
While this U.S. president was staying at Blair House, 2 members of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party tried to assassinate him. One attacker was killed, and this president commuted the death sentence of the other.
Eisenhower.
No,
Truman.
yes.
What did you say about?
Part 3. During World War II, this smaller island just east of Puerto Rico was seized by the U.S. Navy, who evicted many local farmers. After a native was killed by one of the military's frequent weapon tests, mass protests caused the Navy to depart this island in 2003.
Puerto Vallarta.
No, bounce.
Grenada.
Vieques. V-I-E-Q-U-E-S. 10 points each on that bonus. Last question and a half, toss up number 12, category is math. This arithmetic operation can be viewed as a transformation of the complex plane involving an expansion by the modulus and a rotation. Computing this operation with 2 complex numbers involves adding their arguments to find the new angle and produces the result R1, R2 cis of theta 1 plus theta 2. Performing this operation with a complex number and its conjugate always produces a non-negative real number equal to the square of the magnitude. Yep. Your bonus is fine arts. This opera's finale consists of a chaotic 10-part fugue titled Tutto nel mondo è burla, or All the World is a Jest. Part 1. Name this Giuseppe Verdi opera whose fat title knight attempts to seduce Alice Ford and Meg Page as adapted by Arrigo Boito from a Shakespeare play.
Falstaff.
Yes. This other composer also adapted The Merry Wives of Windsor into an opera that he titled Sir John in Love. This Englishman's orchestral works include Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis and The Lark Ascending. Yes. Vaughan Williams also adapted this play by John Millington Synge into a one-act opera. In this opera, Moria sings, "They're all gone now," after learning that her last surviving son, Bartley, has drowned. To the sea, yes. 30 on the bonus. And that is our halftime.
Got 310 to 100.
Good data, ladies and gentlemen. What are our thoughts?
So Jay, you're gonna go in for BL. Everybody else is staying.
Oh, yeah.
Tom Brady to go? Hello?
Oh, I wasn't even gonna do mine.
Said John Darnell. It's like that makes sense. It's like somebody else.
I was freshman year. I remember that.
Yeah, so Owen, Lopez, Phillips, and Christopher. Hey guys, again, give me a deep breath. We're hanging out.
Than I was last time.
Okay.
I don't like that camera. That's scary.
And my boys are watching, so.
Jay.
Oh,
Oh,
cool.
you're aware.
Hey guys.
Have fun, guys. Yeah.
It should have sound.
Yeah, it does.
Somebody's stuck there. I'm going to be at
Alright, you ready to go? Alright, if our subs would do a quick buzzer check. Alrighty, second half begins. Toss up number 13, category is social studies. In 1973, Maud Merrill revised a quantification of this concept. Merrill studied under Louis Terman, who published the 1916 original edition covering examinations like recognition of food and paper cutting. This concept was divided into fluid and crystallized forms. Yep. IQ or intelligence, either one. Bonuses in science. In 1996, U.S. President Bill Clinton announced that a meteorite originating from this planet contained fossils of bacteria, though scientists still haven't reached a consensus on the issue. Part 1. Name this planet where a large volume of underground ice was confirmed to exist in the Utopia Planitia Basin in 2016. Yes. In the next 100 million years, Mars will likely lose both of its moons, with one escaping orbit and the other crashing into the planet. Name both moons. Yes. Part 3. 5261 Eureka is one of these asteroids that travel in Mars' orbit in the Lagrangian points ahead of and behind the planet. More than 1 million of these bodies may share Jupiter's orbit. Yes, 30 on the bonus. Toss-up number 14, category of literature. While at a conference in Mexico, an author from this country plots to conquer the world using an army of clones at Carlos Fuentes. This home country of Cesar Ira is also the setting of a novel about Toto Casals titled Betrayed by Rita Hayworth. In this country, cellmates Valentin and Molina develop a sexual relationship in
Spain?
Nope. In Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig. A blind author from this country created an infinite series of hexagonal rooms in his story, The Library of Babel. For 10 points, name the South American country home to Georges Louis Borges, the setting of Puig's Heartbreak Tango. Yes. Your bonus is miscellaneous. History artist Carol Walker, known for elaborate black paper silhouette series about the history and effects of American slavery, has taught at this university since 2002. 10 points each. Part 1. Name this Ivy League school in New York City. Yes. Part 2. This biologist and 1933 Nobel laureate carried out his landmark heredity experiments on Drosophila in the fly room and at Columbia. Yes. Franz Boas created the first PhD program in anthropology at Columbia, where he taught Margaret Mead. Ruth Benedict and this man, best known for his work chronicling Ishi, the last member of the Yaqui people.
Answer?
Krober or Kraber, Alfred Kraber. 20 points to Auburn on that. Toss-up 15, category is science. Studies of this organelle's functions often use the drug Rifeldin A to prevent its formation. A black reaction using silver nitrate. Yep. Bonus is in history. In 1859, the U.S. nearly went to war with Britain after an American farmer shot a Canadian pig that was eating his potatoes on the disputed San Juan Island. Part 1. The Pig War grew out of lingering resentment from an 1840s dispute in which Americans used this slogan to demand the border latitude of Oregon be pushed north to Alaska. This slogan is often misattributed to James K. Polk's presidential campaign.
54-40.
Yep. I'm sorry, I just thought you were giving it towards me when I looked, you weren't. Part 2, Polk's administration did enact a significant change to the border with this country after the U.S. annexed Texas in 1845. The border with this country was further altered by the Gadsden Purchase of 1854.
Mexico.
Yep. Bears caused the only injuries associated with this undeclared 1830s war, in which lumberjacks contested the boundary between Maine and New Brunswick. This conflict was later settled by the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. 30 on the bonus. Also called the Pork and Beans War. All right, toss-up 16, category is math. A rule of thumb to prescribe this value is Meade's resource equation. The central limit theorem describes a limiting distribution equal to a z-score times the square root of this value. The t value is often used in place of the z value when this quantity is smaller than 30. This value being too low can cause type 2 errors or a false...
Sample size?
You got it. Your bonus is in literature. 4 men with this job squabble over the valuable Glengarry leads, which are controlled by the office manager, John Williamson, for 10 points each. Part 1. Name this occupation of the aging Shelley the Machine Levine, and the smooth-talking Ricky Roma in the play Glengarry Glen Ross.
Real estate agent.
Yep. Part 2. This contemporary American playwright of Speed the Plow and American Buffalo created the scheming real estate salesman in Glengarry Glen Ross. Yes. This 2-character mammoth play centers on Carol's accusation that her Professor John has sexually harassed her. Answer. Tom? No, Oleana. 20 points to Auburn. Toss-up number 17, categories fine arts. In 2006, many of this artist's censored works were collected in the book Impounded. This artist was inspired by anthropologist Conrad Ahrensberg to create The Irish Countryman for Life magazine. A collaboration with Edward Steichen produced this woman's The Family of Man, and her first notable work, White Angel Breadline, earned... Yep. Your bonus is in math. There are many ways that mathematicians define the constant E. Part 1. A calculus-based definition is that E is the base of this type of function that makes the function its own derivative. This type of function takes the form of a constant raised to a variable power. Yep. Another way to define E is as a limit when computing this type of interest, whose formula is given by P times E to the RT power. Yep. Part 3, the interest definition. The interest definition of E sets it equal to the limit as n approaches infinity of the nth power of this quantity. You got 30 on the bonus. Toss up 18, category is history. Fearing seizure by a hostile nation, Denmark chose this year to sell the Virgin Islands to the U.S. Vote.
1917.
Yep. Your bonus is social studies. This river's course runs from the Black Forest to the western shores of the Black Sea. For 10 points each, part 1. Name this river, the second longest in Europe after the Volga. Yep. The Danube River passes through 4 European capital cities, with Vienna the closest to its source. Name any 2 of the other 3. Yep, and the other one is Bratislava. Part 3. The Danube separates the original cities of Buda and Pest, which were linked in 1849 by this suspension bridge, the capital's first permanent bridge. No. Well,
The big bridge.
the what?
The big bridge.
Oh, the big bridge. Chain Secheney Chain Bridge.
That's a big bridge.
I'd like to take a timeout, please.
Okay, 30 or 60?
30's fine. Diego out, Alcuni in, Ashball out, Martin in, Bowen out, Riedel in, Phillips out, Tom in.
I know, Tom.
Mr. Martin, you are captain.
Oh, yeah. Is it her? I thought it was either Len or
Good job on 19.
Yeah.
Need any names or are we good to go?
No, we're good.
Okay.
Okay, so people that came in, test your buzzer real quick.
Okay, who went out where Tom was sitting?
Where Tom's sitting?
Oh, was that
Aaron.
was Blake was sitting?
Aaron went out.
Aaron went out.
Aaron went out.
All right, toss up 19, category of social studies. When applied to Beauchamp-Childress medical ethics, this philosophy shifts the unit of autonomy to the family. This philosophy's Book of Rights lists farmer, scholar, artisan, and merchant as the 4 essential occupations. Followers of this school of thought seek unity with Tian, while those possessing sufficient Ren may become Junzi. The rectification of names is needed to establish order in this school of thought, which places an emphasis on filial piety. Yep. Your bonuses in literature. For 10 points each, give the following about flowers in British poetry. Part 1. In one song, Robert Burns praised his love as being one of these flowers that's newly sprung in June. Herrick's To the Virgins, to make much of time, urges the reader to gather these flowers. Yes. Part 2. A host of these flowers fluttering and dancing in the breeze leads the speaker's heart to fill with pleasure and dance alongside them in a poem by William Wordsworth. Yes. Part 3. In this 1896 collection, the Lent lily that has not long to stay and dies on Easter Day is contrasted with the primrose, the windflower, and the daffodil. A variety of pink climbing rose is now named for this collection, which also contains a poem that observes, early though the laurel grows, it withers quicker than the rose.
Answer?
Bounce?
Lily.
It's called A Shropshire Lad by A.E. Housen. 20 points to Auburn on that bonus. Toss up 20, category is science. Because voltage is proportional to Gibbs free energy, this principle's analog, the Bordwell cycle, can calculate cell potential. In organic chemistry, homolytic cleavage is assumed when applying this concept to bond dissociation energies. The Born-Haber cycle is equivalent to this law when finding an ionic solid's lattice energy. This law allows...
Coulomb's law?
Nope. This law allows ethane's heat of formation to be determined from 3 separate steps. For 10 points, name this summation law stating total enthalpy change of a reaction is independent of the number of steps or the path from reactants to products. Yep. bonus is social studies. Mythological deer are rarely just deer. For 10 points each, part 1. This Theban hunter was punished for seeing Artemis bathing by being transformed into a stag. He was then promptly eaten by his own hounds.
Orion.
Nope, bounce. Time. Actaeon. Part 2. A demon in the form of a golden deer tempts this prince and hero of a namesake Hindu epic to leave his wife Sita in a hut, where she is then captured by the villainous Ravana. No? Yes. Capturing this enormous deer, which was sacred to Artemis and named for its Greek town of origin, unexpectedly occupied Heracles for more than a year during the third of his 12 labors.
Sparta.
No, bounce. It's the Ceryneian hind. Ceryneian, and then Hind. 20, no, 10 to Auburn on that ball. Toss up 21, category is literature. On his deathbed, a Russian immigrant reveals to this woman's family that he once threw a pair of newlyweds to a pack of wolves. On a train ride through Iowa, a man reveals a portfolio of writings about this woman. This woman has to flee from her lecherous employer, Wick Cutter, and she's impregnated and abandoned by the railroad conductor, Larry Donovan. After 20 years away from home, Jim Burden returns to Black Hawk, Nebraska to visit this woman, who is married Anton Kuzak, a fellow Bohemian immigrant. Yep. Bonus is math. For 10 points each, give the following about Vieta's formulas. Part 1. Vieta's formulas give expressions for the sum and product of these values for a polynomial. These values, often denoted R sub I, are inputs that make the value of the polynomial 0. Yep. Part 2. For the quadratic polynomial ax squared plus bx plus c, what is the sum of its roots? You may use Vieta's formulas or realize that the square roots in the numerator of the quadratic formula will cancel when added. No.
Negative B over A.
Yes.
Yeah, tell me.
Isn't that what it said?
I don't know how.
It said B over A.
No, I know. I'm just saying like that. Part 3. For the polynomial 2x cubed minus 7x squared minus 12, what is the product of its roots? No.
Six.
Yes. 10 to Auburn, 20 to Marengo.
I know.
Toss up 22, fine arts. The finale of Johannes Brahms' third piano quartet begins by referencing a theme from this work, whose second movement briefly quotes the Portuguese tune La Folia. This symphony in C minor has a pauseless attacca transition into a C major final movement. Yep. Your bonus is science. For 10 points each, consider a race car traveling around a circular track at a constant speed. Part 1. As it moves, the car experiences this force that is directed towards the center of the track. The magnitude of this force can be calculated as the car's mass times the square of its speed divided by the radius of the track. Yes. The centripetal force is usually the result of this other force between the tires and the track as the car turns. This force's static coefficient must be sufficiently high to keep the car from sliding off the track. Yes. To better keep the car on its path, the racetrack may use this kind of slanting on the curves. The ideal angle for this slope is given by the inverse tangent of v squared over rg. 30 on the bonus. Toss up 23, categories history. The Economic Cooperation Administration was created to implement this program, later extended in the .4 program. Warren Buffett's father, Senator Howard Buffett, led opposition to this program, calling it Operation Rat Hole. The Morgenthau proposal, yes it is. Your bonus is in fine arts. This artist depicted elephants with stork-like legs in his The Temptation of St. Anthony, and elephants reflected by swans in another painting. Part 1, name the Spanish surrealist whose museum in St. Petersburg, Florida houses his painting, The Hallucinogenic Toreador. Part 2, the MoMA houses this Dali painting of the Catalonian coast littered with various clocks that are melting or covered with insects. Dali later created a disintegration of this painting. Yes. Part 3, since 2008, the MoMA has frequently exhibited this 1929 short film, a collaboration between Dali and director Luis Buñuel. Disturbing imagery in this film includes a razor blade slicing an eyeball and a woman's armpit hair transitioning to a sea urchin. 30 on the bonus. And question 24. Toss up is math. A type of these objects named for Cauchy establishes that the real numbers are complete. Whether or not one of these objects reaches 1 from any starting value is the subject of the collapse conjecture. If the limit as the index approaches infinity exists, these objects are said to converge. These objects can be defined recursively, as in the case of the 3n plus 1 problem. These objects contain terms denoted a sub I, with the I usually running from 1 to infinity, and those terms can be added in a series. For 10, yes. Your bonus is history. Though he was a non-believer, this daimyo built the first Catholic church in Kyoto to undermine traditional power bases in his bid to control Honshu. Part 1. Name this first of the 3 great unifiers of Japan. This man revolutionized the army by replacing archers with gunners and was succeeded by his protege, Toyotomo Hideyoshi. Yes. Before and after Oda Nobunaga's time, the de facto rulers of Japan held this title while professing loyalty to the emperor. These leaders effectively ruled as military dictators. Yes. Nobunaga's campaigns began the unifying process that would end this period of Japanese history with a name meaning warring states. This period ended when the Tokugawa shogunate crushed the last Toyotomi resistance in Osaka in 1615. 30 on the bonus, and that is our man.
I got 700 to 130.
Good job, guys.
Are you proud of me, Mr. Bolton?
I am.
I figured you were right.
Do we watch them now? We go back to the other room. I don't think Diego was there that day, because you would remember if you watched them together.